Thank you, everybody, for attending, but also your patience. This is our second presentation in the series, and it's a kind of a dream come true for me because it's something I've really wanted for a long time in even previous parishes. But I'm so glad it's able to be launched, and it's taking off well, I feel, at St. Jude Parish. These presentations are in the spirit of the Catholic intellectual tradition, which simply is an attempt to interpret the signs and the needs of the moment in which we're living, this historic moment, and responding to it in light of the new demands of humanity. So it's a very exciting approach. Always remaining faithful to original sources. Each of the speakers are competent and experts in their field. So with that, then I would like to ask us to pause for prayer at this time. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Gracious God in heaven, you have filled the world with beauty. In the Lenten Easter tide, you open our eyes every year to your gracious hand in all of your creation. Your desire is for us to live in harmony with all the other creatures and everything that you have made. May we learn to share your light with others by opening our minds this evening to your radiant light. We ask this prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen.
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 All right, so I will thank Father Joe for his inspiration and leadership with this series, because he's really the one that wanted to have this for our parish, for our neighbors, and for our friends. So thank you for inspiring us to do this. And I also want to thank Andy Parker, our Zoom master, and Rob Fallon, who will monitor the questions from chat. And before I introduce our speaker, may I please remind you that on Thursday, April 29th, Dr. Gerald McGill, who holds the Vernon F. Gallagher Chair in the Center for Global Health Ethics at Duquesne and is the Senior Fellow in the newly established Carl Griffinstead Center for Ethics in Science, Technology, and Law, will speak to us about something completely different from tonight, artificial intelligence from a Catholic perspective and the dynamic leadership of Pope Francis. And then you won't want to miss Bishop Shelton Joseph Fabre, the Bishop of Humila-Tupelo, Louisiana, who speaks widely about racism, especially from the perspective of the United States Conference on Bishops' letter, Open Wide Your Hearts. Bishop Fabre will be our speaker on May 27th, the last presentation of this season. We hope to begin again in September if you're excited enough about the series. So if you'll respond to the survey that Andy's put together and give us some thoughts about what you'd like us to, speakers that you might like to have, and topics that you'd like for us to have discussed. So now it's my honor and distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Paula Kane, who is the John and Lucine O'Brien Morris Chair in Catholic Studies at the University of Pittsburgh, with a joint appointment in the Department of History. Dr. Kane researches and teaches American religious history with a specialization in modern Catholicism, religion in the arts, and religion in the media. I found this interesting. The Department of Religious Studies at Pitt emphasizes the human search for meaning and value in history, the manner in which particular religious traditions, practices, thoughts, and orientations have evolved over time, and to the degree to which religious views and behaviors have interacted and continue to interact creatively with other systems or thoughts. And I want to take 1 minute to offer a special welcome to Lucine Morris, the sponsor of the chair at Pitt, who I believe is joining us this evening. So now please join me in welcoming Dr. Paula Kane, who will speak about culture creators or culture warriors, Catholics in contemporary society. Dr. Paula Kane.
Well, hello to my new friends in Zoomlandia. I think I'm a well-kept secret at Pitt. Who knew there was a chair of Catholic studies at a public university? So I'm grateful as always to the endowers of this chair, John and Lucine Maris. As most of you know, John received his degree in engineering at Pitt and went on to serve as the CEO of Westinghouse Corporation. And Lucine continues to impress me with her energy, her generous spirit, and sense of humor. And I thank you, my former parish of Sacred Heart, together with folks from St. Raphael, as we celebrate your new parish of St. Jude. Thanks to Father Joe and Mary Lou McLaughlin for the invitation to speak with you this evening, and to Robert Fallon and Andy Parker for helping out with the webinar details, which we hope will all work. As the second speaker in your series, I am happy to make connections to the first speaker. I don't know if Betty Ann Donnelly is logged in tonight, but we can play the 6 degrees of separation game. I never met Betty Ann before hearing her speak on the topic Women in the Church, Women Leaders, but our lives certainly intersect at several points. My mom knew your parents, for instance. Mom and I are fans of your website, Catholic Women Preach. I grew up in the shadow of your alma mater, Georgetown University, where my dad was a professor of philosophy. Our family knew fathers Bill Byron and Brian Hare. I've published a book with Orbis Books. I've had numerous classmates who worked for Bread for the World, and so on. So I thank you, Betty Ann, in any case, for your wonderful work on behalf of women and in expanding the possibilities for women to be visible and contributing to today's church in its myriad service organizations. So let me give a very brief overview of my themes for this evening. I have about 35 images to show you in 45 minutes, so you can do the math. I'm going to argue that after centuries of being controllers of art production and reception, that, church leaders, mostly popes and bishops, became less relevant to the arts, especially in the 20th century, with the advent of new forms of art, such as movies, performance art, photography. Instead of embracing these, American Catholic leaders became spokespersons against most contemporary novelties as part of their effort to build a separate Catholic subculture in America. And many laypersons followed their lead. After the emergence of pop art, however, the opinions of the hierarchy mattered less, as the post-war generation of artists, many of them Catholics, produced art that also functioned as explorations of personal identity and social critique. So the clash between religious authorities and artists produced several controversies, especially in the 1990s. I'm interested in how the Catholic Church, which for centuries was a great patron and creator of the arts, became something different in the 20th century, a Puritan. While it still claimed a role as arbiter of the arts and defender of good taste, the church often hid behind a fortress mentality cultivated by bishops in the early 20th century. It posited an us versus them mentality. Protestants and Jews, apparently, were going to destroy morality and bring ruin upon the nation, and it was up to Catholics to hold the line as defenders of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Catholic leaders, especially bishops and clergy, worked to maintain control of culture and standards. Yet most of the change that happened in the 20th century was beyond the control of the church. many traditional forms of authority were being challenged, and some had been democratized. So once the arts became more democratic, through the expansion of what art could be, it could now include motion pictures, television, video, graffiti, installations, performance art, photography. Art was no longer limited to the fine arts, drawing and painting, sculpture, architecture. The church seemed hesitant to embrace the changes to a more popular democratized culture, and instead doubled down on a moralizing view about what was acceptable in the arts as a way of supervising lay opinion and preserving public morality. And now I will need to try and switch to my slideshow here. Right. And there we go. All right, can everybody see that okay? Excellent. All right, so what do I mean by the term culture war in my title? A culture war is simply the cultural conflict between social groups and the struggle for dominance of their values, beliefs, and practices. It commonly refers to hot button topics on which there is general societal disagreement and polarization. Among Roman Catholics, many modern conflicts have involved the arts because artists have sometimes directly attacked Catholic beliefs, values, and practices, or at least seem to do so. Thus, tonight, I'm going to focus mostly on several controversies about arts in the 1990s. From its high perch, the Roman Catholic Church harked back to the centuries before the French Revolution, when the church controlled the public arena, education, and the arts. During the European Middle Ages, almost all art was sacred art of the Catholic Church, and the same was true of the Renaissance and Baroque eras. It's only been in recent decades that we have seen the presence of an independent Catholic literary, film, and art criticism whose views are not determined to parrot those of the clergy or try to evaluate arts only by their Catholicity. Well, this fellow is probably familiar to you. The Renaissance was still a time when the church guarded art, even though some pagan classical themes were being revived. Think of all those nude paintings of Venus that were hanging in the apartments of the cardinals around Rome. In any case, Catholic popes, cardinals, and bishops were art patrons par excellence, and the Catholic Church was the major client for these works. It didn't matter if some of the themes that were being painted in Catholic art were indeed murderous. We have here the beheading of John the Baptist, because the whole point was to tell sacred stories and to edify the public. So there was a symbiosis between the Bible and what was represented in art, even though during the Renaissance, the humanists introduced anthropocentric approaches to art that were challenging to revealed religion. So even people like Leonardo were making man the measure of all things and human experience the main source of art. John Paul II noted this historic shift in his letter to artists in 1999. Another kind of humanism, he wrote, marked by the absence of God and often by opposition to God, has gradually asserted itself. Such an atmosphere has sometimes led to a separation of the world of art and the world of faith, at least in the sense that many artists have a diminished interest in religious themes. Well, Peter Paul Rubens was not one of those. This painting is part of the series he did called The Triumph of the Eucharist. It was also made into a tapestry. So by the 17th century, a bit after the Renaissance, or in the midst of the Renaissance, Catholic investment in the fine arts served a strongly propagandistic role. That was to negate the new Protestant churches. Here, the major theological divide between Catholics and Protestants was answered vigorously by Rubens to reaffirm the doctrine of transubstantiation. Rubens' canvases grew to enormous sizes. So this painting of the miracles of St. Francis has a parallel painting that shows the miracles of St. Ignatius of Loyola. Not coincidentally, the Jesuits, who were created as a religious order during the Reformation, took a fourth vow to defend the papacy. So the Jesuits became great patrons of the arts themselves and also participants in them, with many composers, painters, cartographers, and so forth joining the ranks of the Jesuits. The Baroque era, which certainly followed the Renaissance, was probably the most extravagant form of expression of Catholicism in the arts. And if you visited any of these churches in southern Germany or Austria, you can see there is not an undecorated inch in these churches. They are a riot of color, of contrast, of restless movement, of gemstones, of precious woods and marble and gilding everywhere. And again, this was an answer to the Protestant Reformation, which was stripping churches of decoration, statues, color, stained glass, and so forth. Flash forward again quickly to the French Revolution, 1789, with Delacroix's famous painting of liberty leading the people. Why is this important for our study of art? Because the French Revolution began in Europe a century of back and forth between Catholics who supported the monarchy, the old regime, and the Republicans who wanted a secular state in France. And in fact, in France, this church-state separation was not achieved until 1907. But more importantly, the French Revolution created a template for the church's future in Europe on the conservative side of politics, favoring the monarchy, the status quo, and opposed to Republican and Democratic representative governments. So a few decades after the French Revolution, we can see a similar situation in Germany. The Germans also will take on the Catholic Church. And so in this cartoon, we can see Otto von Bismarck on the left playing chess with Pope Pius IX. And the Pope is holding a chess piece that's entitled Encyclical, while nearby are other pieces he can deploy called Interdict and the Syllabus of Errors. So the Syllabus of Errors was probably the most anti-modern document you can find in contemporary church history. And in the wake of that Syllabus of Errors, which condemned such things as democracy and voting, the German Protestants worked harder to disempower the Catholic Church. And that can be seen in the chess piece that is nearer to von Bismarck that's marked Klostergesetz. And this refers to the law of 1875, which expelled all religious orders from Germany, except those working in hospitals. So if you've visited Cleveland, you may have passed the Poor Clare Monastery there, and those nuns were forced to leave Dusseldorf and fled and came to Cleveland in the year 1877. So this contrast between Europe and America is worth mentioning. The United States never had an established church, even though 8 of the 13 colonies did. They were all Protestant. And Catholics were the underdogs in the United States. Similarly, there was not an aristocratic past for America. So Americans who came here in the 19th century came as immigrants, as underdogs to a mostly Protestant place. And the part that concerns our story is how and when Catholics started assimilating. It seems that there was some integration accomplished by the 1920s, partly through participation of soldiers in World War I, but it was more common after World War II. Catholics who'd served in that war benefited from all of the phenomena of the post-war period, particularly the GI Bill, which allowed people to go to college at unprecedented levels, men and women, the presence of white-collar jobs in an expanding economy, new infrastructure being built for all of these immigrants who were now leaving the ethnic neighborhoods of cities and moving to the suburbs, and the expanding economy all the way through 1971 that offered people good jobs and access to consumer goods. So if this was an amazing step forward for Catholic assimilation, the post-war era, we can also say that that time also saw changes in the arts, and particularly the arrival of television, the expansion of the film industry in Hollywood, and the fact that there were now more art schools in America and a younger generation willing to attend them created some kind of interesting, or put together an interesting situation for us to think about here. So our Catholics in America had to still put up with this Protestant outlook that we call nativism, in which Protestants regarded themselves as America's true natives. This is one of my favorite political cartoons from the 19th century, done by Thomas Nast, who was known as Nasty Nast for Harper's Illustrated. He is the man, by the way, who created the figure of the modern Santa Claus as we know it. But here he's being kind of a grump about Catholics. So we can see here that the bishops are crawling out of the American River Ganges as alligators, getting ready to devour all these Protestant public school children. And a famous Protestant preacher, Henry Ward Beecher, is standing there to hold them back. We can see that in the background, Tammany Hall, the New York machine for Irish politics, is already flying the Vatican flag. And on the hilltop behind is the ruins of a public school. So if Protestants feared and resented the presence of Catholics in the United States as agents of the Pope, across the Atlantic, the Vatican didn't really understand the American nation either. The Vatican was suspicious of the American system of democratic government. It was very dubious about religious pluralism within one nation, and its greatest fear was apostasy by Catholics living among so many Protestants. Thus, the Vatican regarded the United States as a mission territory until 1907. In the early 20th century, Catholics did begin to succeed in the careers that were known as the 3 Ps: priests, police, and politicians. And that worried Protestants too. So here's a cartoon against Governor Al Smith of New York, the first Catholic to run for president in 1928. And he's shown kneeling and kissing the hand of Cardinal Bonzano, the papal representative to the Eucharistic Congress held in Chicago in 1926. Protestants were terrified of that event as a sign of creeping Romanism. And those powerful archbishops of the 20th century, we'll hear from in a minute, must have enjoyed flexing their muscles by their pronouncements on everything from women's fashions to motion pictures, and of course, about the superiority of the one true church. So one thing I found studying American Catholics is that the hierarchy is dominated by Irish American priests, and so is the parish priesthood through the 1960s. And many of these Irish, whether they were trained at seminaries in Canada or in Europe, because there weren't that many seminaries in the United States, reflected a certain prudishness in their artistic opinions. They weren't really open to novelty in the arts, and they were certainly concerned about things like nudity or lewdness or swearing or drinking and so forth in public settings. So what happened is that the clergy and laity will join forces in the 1930s to attack lewdness in the arts. And you may be aware that for 34 years, the motion pictures of Hollywood were all governed by the MPAA production code, which was written by a Jesuit priest and a layman, Martin Quigley. And after it had been in effect for 3 or 4 years, Catholics were convinced it wasn't being enforced very well. So they got Joseph Breen, a layman from Philadelphia, to participate in enforcement. And he basically reached a deal where every single Hollywood script for a film had to be sent to him first in his Philadelphia office, or sometimes he was in New York. He had to cut every script and approve every script before it could be made into a film. We'll think about censorship in a moment. Another Catholic event that affected the arts at this time was the formation of the Legion of Decency. Some of you may remember having signing pledges for the Legion back in the 40s or 50s or 60s. This mobilized lay Catholics especially, but it also urged Protestants and Jews to back the code by signing these pledge cards. And so the films coming out of Hollywood being rated according to the Legion's strategies. There's a lot of energy around the Legion of Decency. And so here we can see a march. We want decent movies by lots of folks here trying to get people to stay out of the cinema and avoiding those evil and vile movies. Just a few examples of studio censorship. In 1940, a film was nearly condemned because it didn't have lines reflecting the Christian concept of marriage. And the same thing afflicted Greta Garbo's last film in 1941. So the censorship worked. The studios took those lines out of the films and the film was able to be made. The production code that Joseph Breen enforced was pretty stern. There was no nudity allowed in cinema, no homosexuality, no criminals could get away with their crimes. There could be no excessive leg or cleavage shown, no kisses longer than 30 seconds, and if you were going to kiss someone, you had to keep your mouth shut. Topics like adultery could be treated, but with delicacy. Many slang words were banned, even ones that seem inoffensive to us today, like nerds, a word that meant nuts or nonsense in the 1930s. Some directors became quite clever at getting around some of the codes by using sexual innuendo or double entendres in their scripts. Ernest Lubitsch is a director who did that well. Some of Marlene Dietrich's characters and lines skirted the edge of the code, and Mae West's career was nearly ended several times because of her bawdy banter. So you can see the actions of the Legions of Decency here were very much those of the local area. They'd put up these big signs, usually in tandem with the Knights of Columbus, showing which films had been condemned in order to shame people from not attending. Here's a good example of a very popular film that had some problems with Joe Breen, right? So when Rick says to Ilsa, we'll always have Paris, he almost didn't, right? So the film had to be changed in order to fit the demands of the code. So Catholic lay people at this point were not being encouraged to develop their own convictions about film, television, and the plastic arts and music, except inside the moralizing frame that repeated the statements of the hierarchy. Did the art express the ancient Catholic ideals of the good, the true, and the beautiful? It's a lovely formula meant to describe how our seeking for God should involve those kinds of elements. And in the midst of this code that was governing Hollywood, we can see that there were at least a few Catholic films about Catholic topics that became quite popular, particularly Going My Way and The Bells of St. Mary's in the 1940s. And I think that has to be the case because Leo Carey, who wrote the screenplay and the short story these films are based on, was based in Los Angeles. And I really do think in his films, we see a kind of refreshing West Coast view of things, right? Bing Crosby could sing, go golfing, wear straw hats, talk about his past romances and so forth and so on. And it was really a very different kind of film that actually for the first time made Catholic priests and parish life real to non-Catholics who would see these films. This fun-looking trio set the tone for public judgments of Catholics and culture from the 1930s to the 50s. Cardinal Spellman got involved in a major brouhaha in 1956 when he condemned the movie Baby Doll, directed by Elia Kazan. It led the Legion of Decency to stage its first national boycott. Time magazine also disliked the film, but we can see how a bishop laity alliance could rattle the studio heads in Hollywood with threats of these kinds of boycotts. Let's think for a moment about this formula, the good, the true, and the beautiful, which Catholics had absorbed for a long time, coming out of Plato and Aristotle, plus some Augustine, plus some Aquinas. And this was for a long time the long-lasting guides for what Christian art should be and do. But as I was intrigued to find Thomas Merton's judgment in the 1960s. He got sick of these phrases because he said they stood for the sin of Platonism, the reduction of all reality to the level of pure abstraction, as if concrete individual substances had no connection on their own, no reality of their own. And that's a good criticism, I think, for this post-war era. The idea of Catholics wanting art to be representing art as lived, not only as an ideal form. So our post-war era is going to bring challenges not only to screen, but also to art. And the very man who embodies this shift from high art to popular art is Pittsburgh's own Andy Warhol. Sacred images, icons, and signs are everywhere in his work, but his point was to level the distinctions between fine art and things that could be made by anyone and endlessly reproduced, like silk screens and prints. His inspirations included advertising, consumer goods, but also religious themes. And sometimes these two were mixed, as with his many versions of the Last Supper, which often included products overlaid on top that had religious sounding or religious seeming overtones, such as Dove soap, Wise potato chips, and so forth. So with pop art, gone was the emphasis on the artist as the unique creator of sublime things. Here was the new art that could combine several different methods at once, such as Warhol taking photographs from mass media, right out of the newspapers, and silk screening them with the aid of teams of assistants. Incidentally, most of the young men who hung around Warhol in the factory where his art was made were Catholics. As Christopher Makos recalled in his memoirs, Warhol may have related better to us Catholics because we all have the same background: Mass, priest, nuns, Catholic school, and a sense of guilt. I want to talk about, I think I may have skipped a slide there. Yes, I want to talk about 3 post-war Catholic artists that show us, I think, how this pop art really changed things moving forward from Warhol. Mike Kelly, Andre Serrano, and David Wojnarowicz. So we'll look at some of their works. So Mike Kelly's from Michigan, Andre Serrano, born in New York City, and Wojnarowicz from Red Bank, New Jersey. Mike Kelly committed suicide, Serrano is still alive, and David died of AIDS in 1992. So let's look at some of their works. So Mike Kelly popularized these things that we now call installations, and using everyday objects like stuffed animals and blankets, he tried to engage themes of alienation, loss of childhood, memories of childhood. So you can see we've come very far from the Sistine Chapel here. Just the title of this makes me laugh, The Shy Satanist. And here is a video project and installation together. So we have this very large screen in the back of a horned devil looking at us, fluorescent bulbs in a lurid tone. There's actually music that goes with it. There's furniture, all kinds of stuff going on in Kelly's installations. I bet you have probably seen this photograph before. Andre Serrano got in all kinds of trouble for this photograph, which he called Piss Christ. What he did was to take an ordinary crucifix, plastic, and he submerged it in a beaker of urine, and then he photographed it. So one of his goals was to comment on the way in which commercial culture, such as the cheap plastic crucifix here, had cheapened notions of the sacred. But Catholic condemnations of the photo didn't even pay attention to his intention. They merely did a very literal reading of the object. So much for the great Catholic tradition of allegorical and metaphorical readings. Andre Serrano also was fascinated with Catholic art, and he loved the Spanish Baroque painter Francisco Zurbarán. And we can see here Zurbarán's crucifixion on top and a startling upside down crucifixion, which he also painted. And what Serrano did was to get permission to take photographs inside of an undisclosed police morgue in 1992. So he created a series of 36 photographs, essentially, of corpses or of parts of corpses. But really, the series is a very stern and sobering reflection on death, asking us to recall the crucifixion as well as the forms of violence that exist in American cities today. Our third artist of this post-war trio was David Wojnarowicz, and he's harder to characterize because he deliberately refused to have a signature style. And he put many arts together in his work. He used graffiti, he would add new wave music in the background, photography, performance art, neo-expressionist painting. We can put him at the center of these culture wars in the 1980s and 90s. But in a larger sense, we can say that he belongs with other tradition-breaking Americans like Walt Whitman, another poet of experience and of the body. David's art installation is often provocative and even blasphemous, but we should always begin with questions rather than answers. Why is it so? What is the social context for the artist's gesture of protest? So in this installation here, soon all this will be picturesque ruins from just a few years ago, we can literally read the writing on the wall. And he comments, "We are living in a time when horrible destruction can come from an individual who can do this anonymously by pushing a button or casting a vote, but without ever having to see or address or be responsible to the persons being affected." So he's really making a very important message about the need for us to encounter other humans face to face and to be aware of the effects of our actions, and a kind of call of alarm about the anonymity of those who did things like bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki and even talk about nuclear weapons buildups, along with our elected officials, because he does address things here, access to healthcare and so forth and so on. Well, if these three provocateurs weren't enough, things came to a real crisis point in 1999 when a show from London came to the Brooklyn Museum of Art. It was called Sensation. And I went to that show. I remember it quite well. Interestingly enough, in London, the focus of outrage was the image of a murderer that was made out of the sort of painted handprints from children. But in the United States, it was a dung Madonna by the Nigerian British artist Chris O'Feely that people were outraged by, or at least Rudy Giuliani, you remember him, were. So Giuliani led these protests, having never actually seen the painting in question. But he did say, let's see, having a city subsidized building have so-called works of art in which people are throwing elephant dung at a picture of the Virgin Mary is sick. The city shouldn't have to pay for sick stuff. So many of the debates that ensued were about defunding the museum. And here is the actual painting in question. So, as you can see, there is no dung thrown at the canvas. In fact, we have an image of the Virgin in her blue robe, and the painting rests on the floor of the gallery on these two lumps of elephant dung. So archbishops and Mayor Giuliani weren't really interested in art, but they were claiming that old position of arbiter of taste and moral judge. So instead of condemning O'Feely's dung Madonna, they should have perhaps asked, why does dung have a presence in his art? Because it's not just in this painting, it's in a lot of his paintings. And how did he make his way as a Nigerian living in racist England? And was it the blackness of the Madonna that was perhaps more alarming than the two pieces of dung that supported the canvas? Enter the Catholic League. William Donahue, I didn't realize till researching this, had taught briefly at La Roche College in Pittsburgh, and he became the president of the league when he took it over from somebody else. And the goal of this so-called Catholic League, which was endorsed by no official Catholic Church institution, was to fight anti-Catholicism. Unfortunately, much of what Donahue said is not perhaps the best example of opinion making that serves the Catholic Church as an ideal layman. So almost everything he said got him into worse trouble. And I think that much of this Catholic negativity against culture was in response to art trends that had surfaced and crystallized in the 1990s. So artists tackled central issues at that time, particularly Reaganomics, another crisis point in the economy when the very rich divide between very rich and very poor was pronounced, the AIDS crisis, anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia, and anti-feminism. Oops. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about performance art then. This was another trend from the 70s. And again, Andy Warhol and his friends were right there at the beginning. So performance artists emphasize a live presentation to an audience, physical movement, creations that are ephemeral. So performance art challenges the very notions of art as something that's static and permanent and hangs on a museum wall. The performances may include film, video, photographic and installation-based artworks in which the actions of the artists, the performers, and sometimes even the audience are shown. So in this way, performance art is quite theatrical, as we can indeed regard the Catholic Mass. There's a kinetic quality to much performance art. Things are set in motion. Some of them are intended to shock. Some can't help but rely on religious themes of crucifixion, pain, sainthood, martyrdom. So the French artist here, Orlan, who I've used, did a very strange and extreme performance piece in which she used surgery to make herself less beautiful based on a collage of previous male artists' notions of perfect beauty. So part of the performance was actually filming her own surgeries and then taking photographs of the results. You can see the photo at the top. She's still recovering from surgery to her eyelids, I think. So it's a very extreme example of performance art. And this one amazed me. It's an explicitly religious piece from 1978 in which she recalls the famous Bernini statue of Saint Teresa in ecstasy that's in a chapel in Rome. So what she did for her performance was to have three men, or actually a series of men, maybe six or so, carry her in a 3-hour-long procession to the Palazzo Grassi Museum in Venice. And there she lay in these white draperies in a coffin-like box. Later, she crawled out of the box, shed her clothing, and disappeared into a, what do you call it? A gondola that was waiting for her on the canal. So in a sense, she was defeating the very things that she felt contained her as a woman, and her motion and spontaneity enacts the very process of not being controlled by others, including liberation from religious authorities. To think about this in a more hopeful sense, Vatican II definitely marks a breaking point in how the Catholic Church has regarded artists and art, and indeed the laity altogether. So the age of the laity is being announced in the 1960s, and we now have, stemming from that post-war training and education, a number of Catholic professionals in all fields, including the arts, journalism, and arts criticism. And there is now a more sophisticated group of people who can make opinions, form opinions about the arts. So the hierarchy is no longer the determining word on the arts, and lay Catholics are learning to make their own judgments of it. I was impressed by John Paul II's letter to artists, which he issued on Easter Sunday in 1999. He wrote, "Within the vast cultural panorama of each nation, artists have their unique place. Obedient to their inspiration in creating works both worthwhile and beautiful, they not only enrich the cultural heritage of each nation and of all humanity, but they also render an exceptional social service in favor of the common good." And I think, in terms of Americans thinking of their place in a formerly mostly Protestant America, this has been one of the most consistently helpful parts of Catholic teaching, to emphasize the common good rather than the constant pursuit of profit or consumption of more and more things. And I suspect that some of you, since you are reading people, are aware of the professional opinions about art, television, and films that appear in 3 signature journals for Catholics, or 1 newspaper, National Catholic Reporter, and Commonweal and America magazine, both of which I've followed through the decades, looking at the histories of how their editorial boards and their opinions about the arts have changed. I was delighted to find out that Pope Francis himself made a documentary film and a book using the Vatican Museum's collections. He took 11 works and spoke about them in a very personal way. He still imagines that art is to be used for evangelization purposes, but at least he refrains from condemnations of contemporary art. In fact, when Francis mentions that art contrasts with the exclusionary and wasteful practices he laments in contemporary life, he shares much in common with contemporary artists who likewise challenge our consumerism and our failure to care for our common home. So, what is the future for Catholic arts and art critics? Let's conclude by drawing together some of the threads to return to where we started this evening, by encouraging intellectual curiosity among Catholics and honoring initiatives among the laity that engage their expertise. So, looking back upon the era of the Church's fortress mentality prior to Vatican II can help us imagine a better future, a more inclusive future, a future that is not afraid of the arts, even the new ones. So, if we regard the work of Vatican II as an ongoing process of aggiornamento, then along with Pope Francis, perhaps we will see a new convergence between artists and art that addresses issues also dear to him: care for the environment, empathy for all, critiques of consumerism. And since the Sharing the Light program is about what laity can do to assist and build the church, my short answer is support its artists and independent criticism of the arts. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your expertise and for finding all these wonderful slides and for just creating exactly what Sharing the Light is all about. So Andy or Rob.
Yeah, I think I could take it from here. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank you as well, Paula. That was so rich. You put a great deal of insight and wide-ranging research into just a few minutes. So there's quite a lot going on here, and I'm sure we're all very grateful for that. Before I kick off the questions, I want to encourage everybody out there in Zoomlandia to add your own question, if you would, into the chat. If you have any thoughts, comments, questions for Dr. Paula Kane, please put them in the chat, and I'll be happy to convey them myself by reading them. Until they appear, though, I guess I would like to ask you, Paula, to comment on something that is only, I think, relevant to part of your talk, but it has to do, I think, with the part that suggested that the church stances in relation to art had gone from essentially being an arts patron to being an art critic. And I wonder if there's a way that that is tied up with issues of politics in some manner. I found the following quotes from the poet Dana Gioia, who's written on similar topics. He writes, what absorbs the Catholic intellectual media is politics. And he says that's bad for Catholicism. And he goes on to say, if American Catholicism has become mundane enough to be consumed by party politics, perhaps it's because the church has lost its imagination and creativity. So I'm wondering if you have, I don't know, if that sparks any notions in you. Do you want to push back against that and say, no, the church has been creative? Or does that sound spot on, that the church has kind of built a sphere for itself around, like the contemporary American church, around politics largely, and therefore ignores the arts?
I guess I view it in a slightly different way. I would say that the cocoon that those bishops built by mid-century in America was a protective cocoon, to the extent that politically Protestants were not happy about these Catholics making their way and getting ahead in America. And so a Catholic separate subculture emerged, full of all these parallel Catholic institutions, right? And in that world, I think Catholics still imagine themselves to be far superior in the arts and expression than Protestants were. But then they became quite judgy about the art and just sort of moralizers. And that's maybe where the politics part enters in, that if you see the name of William Donahue in the Catholic League, you can already predict what the opinion is going to be, something negative about the art or the film or the television show that he's commenting on. There's scarcely anything that they approve of. So I'm interested in why it was that at a time when lay people had more freedom to not only express themselves, but to think for themselves, instead, they usually fell back on these older formulas and parroted back what bishops had said in preceding decades and indeed centuries. So what I found in researching this was a kind of a slow process for Catholic intellectuals to emerge, and for Catholic critics to emerge, and for Catholics to respect even the artists that came from their own tradition. So in terms of what Dana Gioia is saying, I'm not sure we're meaning politics in the same way. What do you think?
Right. No, I hear you. I think he's speaking about, I think the relative neglect, I think, or the separation of sort of church and arts, and that the church has been focused on politics. But following up on this, it's a perfect segue to a comment and a question from Patrick Hughes, who writes the following: in trying to assert or reassert its status as the arbiter of the good, the true, and the beautiful, did the Catholic Church leadership end up creating new and surprising alliances with conservative evangelical Protestant Christians? And could this be seen as a mechanism, or maybe as a symptom of, further Catholic assimilation? Interesting comment.
Thanks, Patrick. I would expect a good comment from him. He was one of my graduate students. Yes, I do think there has been a relatively recent merging of Catholic conservatives and people like William Donahue of the Catholic League have merged with the Protestant evangelicals on the War on Christmas issue, certainly. And another point of contact is, of course, the anti-abortion movement, where people in Operation Rescue joined forces with conservative Catholics and conservative Baptists in a lot of ways. In terms of a dismal record on having a good outlook on the arts, or an educated opinion on the arts, I would say that evangelical Protestants and conservative Catholics are kind of on the same wavelength. They're very fearful of things, and in general, they take an attitude that we must protect, our children, our families, our schools from any of these outside influences that are dangerous. So they're always, in a sense, they're in a fearful, fear of attack mode, and a defensive posture is how I would characterize both these Protestant evangelical conservatives and Catholic conservatives. I can't remember if there's another part of the question I failed to answer.
I think you got it. There are several questions here that suggest that, to me, if I can paraphrase them and lump them together, that people are hankering for a little bit of clarity about whatever happened to the good, true, and beautiful, and what's wrong with them. Is there a different paradigm now? And I think maybe that was something that people would like to hear a little bit more about.
Okay, I would say the good, true, the beautiful is still with us. In my own opinion, it's not an adequate way to address much contemporary art. This is a kind of statement that, again, reflects that very merging of Greek idealist philosophy with Augustine and Aquinas. So in a sense, it's a much older theological formula for viewing the arts. John Paul II, I think, falls in that vein very much, though he at least takes this in a more, I guess, outward direction. And Francis goes a bit further than him. But for many Catholics, this is still the only view about the arts that they apprehend. And the hardest thing is, once you get past, say, 1950, much art is deliberately not made to conform to those principles, right? Some artists deliberately choose the ugly or the difficult or the shocking for different purposes. And it doesn't help Catholics who cannot understand this material by using that formula. So I would just suggest putting that to rest and take up what Merton suggested, that these certain idealized notions of art served a purpose, but we have to think more creatively about the kind of art that is being produced now and why it's being produced. So one of the things that's delighted me in Pittsburgh is access to so many museums. And if any of you have attended the International at the Carnegie every 4 years, you know that sometimes the pieces that are there are quite challenging. And you have to ask a lot of questions because it's not ever immediately apparent what's going on there. Unlike if you looked at, a Michelangelo painting of a biblical scene, you could probably figure out what was going on. But the newer productions are much harder to figure out.
Someplace like Dubai.
Whoops. I'm hearing other voices.
Could ask that everyone mute themselves so there's no interference. Well, let me continue on again. I think a very good segue here has to do, in fact, with what's going on today. Several questions addressing that. I'll read this one in particular from Michael. Is there contemporary artwork that the church would recommend or support? I see the Catholic Church criticizing things that it doesn't agree with. Where are Catholics supposed to experience art? And Andy chimed in saying, can you suggest about, how does he write this? He says, can you tell us about Catholics who approach the arts more positively than Donahue did? So.
Rats, I didn't bring my handy list of those people, but they're out there. If you go to the Vatican, there is a surprising museum of modern religious art. And when I went there, I thought, well, this is going to be a bore and a half, but it was really astonishing. And I knew virtually none of the names. Some of them are from places like Uruguay or Argentina and so forth. So not the usual suspects. It's not just Western Europeans who are doing very inventive things with art and religious themes. I guess for my purposes, I tend to watch a lot of films for the potential of using them with my students. But there you see like an obsessive treatment of religious themes in so much contemporary film. But as to the question of where does one go to experience it, I mean, it's all around us. So no matter what city I'm in, I always go to the art museum, but I'll try more often now the contemporary art museums because they're more difficult. They're more puzzling. You can't put them in categories or stick them in boxes. And the world of creators is so astonishing. So
It seems, it,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Go
Well,
ahead.
I was just thinking in part during your presentation how utterly relevant this topic is even to what was going on in Capitol Hill today, where there are lawmakers there interviewing the head of Facebook and other social media companies. This kind of democratization of media is not just within the arts, as you were just saying, it's really everywhere. And it does perhaps, come with great opportunities and great challenges. One small challenge, I don't know if you have a comment about that, but there's one comment here that someone wanted to know, well, what do we do about our kids and their exposure to electronic art these days? I'm not quite sure what is meant by that, but there's a concern about raising children in this world of online culture.
Yeah, I'm sort of low tech, so, and I don't have to worry about that, but I do know that children can find virtually anything they want on the internet. And one of the things I try to cultivate with university students is that the phone is just not a place to find Snapchat photos and images of your friends, people doing stupid stuff, cats playing the piano and so forth. But really, you can use it as a tool for education. So even at museums, there are always audio guides, for example, that can be accessed through usually a phone or something. And the fact that the arts have become so democratized that in a sense anybody can be an artist and put their stuff out on the internet is a challenge. As you point out, there is not much sense of what's worthwhile and what's just junk. So again, the notion of anyone a creator is a positive notion, I think, and the Catholic Church is probably still reacting a bit to that, its loss of position as top dog who was in charge of determining what was good art and what was not bad, good art. Much art is not related to religious themes. So if you see museums that are dedicated to religious art, I would say that there's the museum in Cologne that has done some fantastic exhibitions of contemporary art and sculpture. Certainly that museum in Rome, the Vatican, and a host of things around the United States where you come upon surprising instances of very religious themes in art that are always just ways to make you think about why is this person doing this in the 20 teens or 2020s,
And that's just in the world of sort of secular or profane art, but within the sacred spaces of, like, there are new cathedrals in Oakland and LA, and the Sagrada Familia is going to be completed in a handful of years.
I don't know about that. Every 10 years they put off the date another 10 years.
They're working on it. And so yeah, there's a tremendous amount of modern art in these structures as well.
Yeah, and I would
Well,
say, just in reference quickly to the Sagrada Familia, that Gaudi became sort of a religious fanatic in his late years. He became a sort of mystic hermit. He had virtually no support from the Catholic Church for his project. And if you go there, you can see how much of the cathedral's decor is informed by the natural world, particularly marine animals and creatures. But he was a fanatic about St. Joseph, for example, and even the rooftops of his houses in Barcelona are like the chimney pots and everything are symbols of St. Joseph, Jesus, and Mary. So talk about a religious fanatic, but he's already a century, more than a century ago, and we're still catching up with his innovations in art.
that's for
So
sure.
I feel it must be hard to be an art critic because when you condense something out of hand and then you prove looks silly a century later, I feel that with much of our contemporary art, it might seem strange or odd or off-putting to us. But if we understand the context for it, if we understand why the artist is doing that, it helps a lot, and it helps contain our first judgment on our part and help us understand why the object is there.
Good thoughts. I think we'll close out the Q&A then. Thank you once again. All right, now then I'd like to turn things over to Mary Lou once again.
Well, I am just delighted. I'm overwhelmed by your expertise and what you have found, what you put together for this evening's presentation. I know this isn't something that you would have done for the kids, for the students, how diligently you worked on this. And I can't thank you enough. I really thank you. And I saw that Lucine was on, and I hope she got to hear your lovely words in the beginning. So we thank you, Lucine, for being the sponsor of Paula's chair. Thank you very much. And I want to remind you all again that next month, Dr. Paul McGill, complete departure from tonight's, will speak about artificial intelligence and its role in the Catholic Church. And then I think Andy has put a survey in the chat, and we would love to have your thoughts about not only tonight and last month, but about thoughts for what you'd like to see in the future. Speakers that you may know of, or speakers that you would just like us to find. And we would like to do that for you. So thank you all very, very much. And may you have a blessed Holy Week and a very happy Easter. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Paula.